Tonight, we're traveling back in time to meet the ancestors of the largest animals on Earth. 50 million years ago, they looked nothing like whales. They were small, four legged, fur covered creatures, something like a dog or maybe a long tailed wolf. They breathed air and lived on land, as their ancestors had for millions of years. But something kept pulling them toward the water. The fossil record finds them at the shoreline, again and again, wading into warm, shallow seas, hunting fish in the shallows, spending more time in the water than any of their relatives. And over millions of years, their bodies began to change. Legs shortened, tails flattened, nostrils drifted slowly toward the top of the skull, fur thinned, then disappeared, bones grew dense and heavy, better for sinking, worse for walking, each generation a little less suited for land, a little more shaped by the sea. But why would a stable land mammal abandon systems that had kept it alive for millions of years? What pushed this lineage to remain at the shoreline when retreat was still possible? And why did this choice, once made, never reverse? Tonight, we'll follow that journey. We'll trace the bones from shore to open ocean. But before we begin, if you enjoy videos like this, slow, soothing, and quietly filled with wonder, I'd love it if you gave this one a like and maybe tapped subscribe. It helps more curious minds like you find their way to this peaceful little corner of the internet. And if you'd be so kind, let me know in the comments, where are you winding down from tonight and what time is it there? It's always a joy to see how far across the world this little sleepy corner of science travels. Now take a deep breath, let your body settle, and together let's drift back to the time when whales still walked. The earth that cradled this transition was resting in a long, warm pause, a time when the planet breathed slowly and evenly, and extremes softened into gentler patterns. During the early Eocene, heat spread more freely around the globe, carried by oceans that moved warmth instead of locking it away in ice. Rain fell more often, clouds lingered longer, and forests reached toward latitudes that would later grow quiet and bare. Without permanent ice at the poles, the oceans expanded outward and upward, lifting shorelines higher onto the continents and reshaping the edges of the world. Where land once ended sharply, it now faded gradually into water through deltas, tidal flats, lagoons, and broad continental shelves. These were not narrow beaches, but wide transitional zones that shifted with tides and seasons, sometimes solid enough to walk on, sometimes swallowed quietly beneath the sea. The boundary between land and ocean did not hold still. It drifted back and forth, erasing certainty, creating places where feet, paws, and waves all left their marks in the same soft ground. Rivers carried nutrients from inland forests and grasslands into these shallow seas, feeding blooms of life that gathered where fresh and salt water met. The result was a living margin, constantly renewed, where energy pooled instead of dispersing, and where food did not appear in brief bursts, but returned again and again with dependable rhythm. Along these shorelines, abundance became ordinary. Fish moved through warm, shallow waters in great numbers, joined by crustaceans, mollusks, and countless smaller organisms that thrived in sunlight and nutrients stirred by tides. Carcasses washed in from land, plant matter drifted outward from river mouths, and plankton grew thick enough to cloud the water with motion. For animals capable of approaching the edge without fully committing to either realm, these zones offered something rare in deep time, a reliable supply of food that did not demand long migrations or precise timing. Inland environments could be unpredictable, shaped by droughts, fires, or shifting vegetation, while deeper marine waters required skills and bodies that few land mammals possessed. The shoreline, however, asked for flexibility rather than perfection. It rewarded curiosity, patience, and the ability to linger. An animal could feed in shallow water, retreat briefly to solid ground, then return again as tides changed, learning the pattern slowly, step by cautious step. Over generations, this steady richness softened the risks of experimentation, not by removing danger, but by making survival possible even while bodies were inefficient and behavior uncertain. The shoreline did not demand immediate mastery. It allowed mistakes, repeated attempts, and gradual adjustment, all under the constant presence of food close at hand. This environmental stability did not force change, but it made endurance possible during change. The warmth of the climate reduced the cost of heat loss and water, while shallow depths limited the dangers of pressure and prolonged submersion. Waves broke gently across wide shelves instead of crashing abruptly against steep drop offs, creating calm zones where movement in water could be practiced without being overwhelmed. Tides shaped daily rhythms, teaching timing and awareness, while the mingling of ecosystems brought prey within reach of those willing to wade a little farther than before. Over time, repeated crossings between land and water became less about exploration and more about routine. The shoreline became a place not just of passage, but of residence, a stretched out threshold where life could linger. In this blurred space, evolution did not rush forward with clear direction. It moved slowly, guided by persistence rather than efficiency, shaped by survival across thousands of ordinary days instead of single dramatic moments. The age of shorelines offered no promises, only opportunity, held open long enough for transformation to continue. And in that patient overlap between worlds, the long commitment to water found the conditions it needed to keep going, not because the ocean was already welcoming, but because the edge between worlds was gentle enough to endure. By the time this story reaches the shoreline, mammals were no longer tentative newcomers to the world. The great absence left behind by the dinosaurs had already been filled with motion, breath, and variety. Across continents, mammalian bodies diversified into an astonishing range of forms, each shaped by its own quiet experiments with survival. Some moved swiftly across open ground, others climbed and clung to trees, while many settled into the complicated margins where water softened the land. Riverbanks, wetlands, floodplains, and coastal plains became especially crowded places, not with dominance, but with adaptability. These landscapes offered shelter, food, and constant change, qualities that rewarded flexible bodies and attentive behavior. In these settings, water was not an enemy or a destination. It was simply another texture of the world, flowing alongside roots and stones, rising and retreating with seasons and storms. Mammals learned its moods early, stepping into it to drink, to forage, to escape heat, or to evade predators. Their lives did not draw hard lines between dry ground and wet ground, but instead followed gradients, paths that faded gently from one to the other. Some mammals had already begun to shape their lives around this overlap. Semi-aquatic living was not new, nor rare. Bodies existed that could swim competently without surrendering their grip on land, that could feed in water and rest on shore, that carried fur dense enough to repel moisture and limbs strong enough to pull free from currents. These animals did not belong fully to either realm, and they did not need to. Their success came from remaining unfinished in both. They used water as a refuge and resource, not as a home, slipping in and out of it with ease that came from repetition rather than specialization. This pattern spread quietly across lineages, not as a single direction, but as a shared solution to living in landscapes shaped by rivers and tides. Entering water did not demand renunciation, it asked only for tolerance, for the ability to endure moments of imbalance and recover again on solid ground. At this stage, land remained central. It offered reliable air, stable footing, familiar methods of movement, and places to raise young with less immediate risk. Water was approached cautiously, used briefly, and left behind without consequence. Within these communities, bodies carried no signal that a permanent departure was inevitable. Limbs were still built for walking, spines for bearing weight, lungs for breathing air without interruption. Even those that foraged most often near water did so while retaining a full relationship with land. This balance allowed mammals to experiment without being trapped by the outcome. A failed swim did not end a lineage, because retreat was always possible. The shoreline supported this reversible lifestyle, offering constant opportunity without demanding commitment. Food gathered there in layers, some drifting just below the surface, others hiding in mud and shallows, still others arriving from inland forests through winding rivers. Predators lurked in both directions, but escape routes multiplied rather than vanished. One could flee into water or back onto land, choosing whichever path felt safer in that moment. This flexibility defined life before the shift. Survival did not depend on mastery, only on attentiveness and endurance. Over long spans of time, however, repetition leaves its mark. Movements repeated daily become familiar, then habitual, then quietly favored. Bodies that spent more time waiting found that water reshaped effort and resistance, slowing some motions while easing others. Limbs lifted differently, muscles worked under altered strain, senses began to encounter signals softened or distorted by liquid. None of this demanded transformation yet. It simply accumulated as experience passed between generations. The mammals of this time lived in a world where land and water cooperated rather than competed, and where crossing between them carried little cost. This was not a moment of decision, but a long preparation, a phase where comfort with water grew without urgency or intent. The future shift did not announce itself here. It rested beneath ordinary days, carried forward by animals that still returned to land each night, breathing familiar air, unaware that their patience and persistence were quietly laying the groundwork for a commitment that had not yet begun. The ancestors that stand at the beginning of this chapter were unmistakably creatures of the land. Their bodies were built for weight, for friction against soil and stone, for the steady pull of gravity that pressed bones downward and shaped every movement. Limbs extended beneath them with confidence, joints locked and released in familiar rhythms, and hips carried the full burden of a body designed to walk long distances without sinking or floating. Fossils from this time preserve that certainty clearly. Legs were fully formed, capable of lifting and supporting mass, while spines aligned to keep the torso balanced above the ground. Teeth tell a similar story, shaped for gripping and cutting prey that lived and died on land, animals caught in forests, plains, and along river margins. Nothing in these early remains suggests an animal meant to swim for its life or feed beneath the surface. Air filled the lungs easily, senses worked best above water, and every system still belonged firmly to a terrestrial world. Yet within this clarity, quiet irregularities begin to appear, details so small they would mean little in isolation, but together hint at a life that was starting to lean ever so slightly toward the edge. These early changes did not announce themselves as progress. Bone density begins to increase subtly, adding weight where lightness had once been favored. This extra mass did not improve movement on land, and it did not yet grant control in water. It simply altered the way the body settled, pressing it lower, making buoyancy less automatic when entering shallow pools or flooded flats. Limb proportions show faint shifts as well, not dramatic shortening or reshaping, but small adjustments in thickness and joint angles that suggest different stresses passing through bone. Muscles attached in slightly altered patterns, responding to movements that included pushing against resistance that yielded and flowed rather than pushing back firmly. None of this would have turned a land mammal into a swimmer. Instead, it made certain motions more awkward on solid ground while doing little to improve efficiency elsewhere. Walking remained possible, but perhaps just a bit more tiring. Entering water became marginally easier, though still clumsy and uncertain. The body existed in a narrow state of imbalance, changed enough to feel strain, yet not changed enough to gain a clear advantage. What makes this stage remarkable is not what these animals could do, but what they tolerated. They continued to survive while carrying traits that offered no immediate payoff. The shoreline environments already described allowed this tolerance to persist. Shallow water did not demand speed or precision, only persistence. An animal could wade, stumble, retreat, and try again, day after day, generation after generation. Over time, repeated exposure meant that slight differences in bone weight or limb resistance mattered, not as breakthroughs, but as accumulated experiences written slowly into anatomy. The skeleton did not leap toward a new design. It drifted, and because land still remained accessible, these early whale ancestors were not forced to choose. They could still hunt inland, rest on dry ground, and retreat fully from water when needed. The subtle adaptations appearing in their bones did not sever any ties. They merely loosened them, introducing flexibility where there had once been rigid certainty. In this phase, evolution acted less like an inventor and more like an editor, making small revisions without clear direction, testing how far a terrestrial body could bend without breaking. Each generation inherited a slightly altered balance between weight and movement, between land and water, without knowing which side would eventually matter more. The fossils preserve this hesitation beautifully. They show animals still whole, still grounded, still capable, yet carrying within their skeletons the earliest traces of a different relationship with gravity and resistance. Nothing irreversible has occurred yet. Land remains possible, familiar, and safe. But beneath the surface of bone, pressure is building quietly, shaping bodies that are no longer exactly what they were, and not yet what they will become. As generations passed, the quiet adjustments written into bone began to gather weight, not as a single transformation, but as a layered accumulation of small differences that subtly reshaped how the body met the world. Bones grew denser, not dramatically thicker, but heavier in a way that changed how the body settled in water, pulling it downward instead of letting it float easily at the surface. This added mass offered no gift on land, where each step demanded more effort and joints absorbed greater strain with every movement. In shallow water, however, this weight reduced the constant upward pull that once fought against stability, allowing the body to remain submerged a little longer without frantic effort. Limbs followed a similar path of compromise. They shortened slightly, losing some of the leverage that made walking efficient, yet they did not gain the broad surfaces or stiffened joints that would make swimming powerful. Each step on land became less graceful, while each push through water remained weak and uncertain. The spine, once firm and supportive, began to loosen its segments, allowing gentle waves of motion to pass along its length. This flexibility hinted at a future where propulsion would come from the body itself rather than from limbs pushing against ground, but in this moment it introduced instability. The torso bent and swayed in ways that complicated balance on land, while still lacking the coordination needed for smooth movement through water. Every part of the skeleton seemed to shift just far enough to interfere with what it once did well, without yet providing a reliable alternative. Living within this in-between form demanded endurance more than skill. Movement became awkward in both environments, not catastrophically so, but persistently enough to shape daily life. On land, running lost efficiency, sharp turns became more difficult, and long pursuits cost more energy than before. In water, forward motion arrived slowly, strokes were uneven, and control depended on shallow depth rather than strength or speed. The body had entered a phase where it no longer excelled anywhere, yet still survived through persistence and familiarity with its surroundings. The shoreline continued to offer shelter for this imbalance, softening the cost of inefficiency. Shallow waters allowed rest without drowning, while land remained close enough to recover breath and stability when needed. Over time, muscles adapted to this mixed demand, strengthening in patterns shaped by resistance that shifted from firm ground to yielding water and back again. The nervous system learned to coordinate movement through changing mediums, building tolerance rather than precision. These animals did not move elegantly. They moved adequately, and adequacy was enough to continue. The fossil record reflects this prolonged awkwardness, preserving skeletons that show no sudden leap toward aquatic mastery, only a steady departure from terrestrial perfection. Each generation inherited a body that was slightly less at home on land and only marginally better prepared for water, carried forward because survival still remained possible. There was no single moment where balance tipped fully. Instead, the body drifted into a condition where retreat became increasingly costly. Returning to full terrestrial life would have required undoing many small changes at once, changes that now interacted with each other in complex ways. The spine expected flexibility, the limbs accommodated shortened reach, and the bones carried weight that no longer favored dry ground. None of these traits alone sealed fate, but together they narrowed options quietly. Movement through the world became a constant negotiation, and within that negotiation, the shape of a new life continued to take form, slow, imperfect, and patient. Living between land and water carried a price that grew heavier with each passing generation, not because the environment turned hostile, but because existence itself became more demanding. Transitional animals occupied a narrow strip of the world where danger arrived from multiple directions and safety rarely stayed in one place for long. On land, familiar predators still moved with speed and confidence, adapted to firm ground and open sightlines, while near the water's edge new threats waited just beneath the surface, unseen until they lunged upward. The shoreline offered abundance, but it also gathered hunters from both realms into the same space. An animal stepping into shallow water escaped some land-based pursuers, yet exposed itself to unfamiliar attacks from below. Retreating back onto land reversed the balance but never fully restored security, as weakened movement and heavier bodies reduced the ability to flee efficiently. Survival required constant awareness, careful timing, and repeated choices about when to enter or leave the water, each decision carrying consequences that could not always be anticipated. This divided danger reshaped daily behavior, limiting where these animals could rest, feed, or give birth without risk, and forcing them to remain active and alert even during moments that once allowed recovery. Energy demands rose quietly, but relentlessly. Inefficient movement meant that every task required more effort than before. Walking consumed additional strength as bones carried extra weight and limbs lost leverage, while swimming offered little compensation, producing forward motion that was slow and uneven. Muscles worked harder to achieve less, and fatigue arrived sooner, reducing the margin for error during escapes or long foraging bouts. Caloric needs increased at the same time that feeding became more complex, as prey on land and in water demanded different strategies and timing. The shoreline provided food, but gathering it now involved greater exposure and longer effort. Extended time spent moving between environments amplified wear on joints, muscles, and lungs, while recovery remained incomplete because rest itself became less secure. Over many seasons, this imbalance between energy gained and energy spent placed pressure on survival in subtle ways. Animals that failed to meet their increased demands did not collapse suddenly. They weakened gradually, becoming slower, less resilient, and more vulnerable with time. Reproduction, once anchored safely on land, grew increasingly uncertain as bodies changed and lifestyles shifted. Giving birth near shorelines introduced new hazards, from flooding tides to predators drawn by movement and scent. Newborns faced immediate challenges as their ability to move effectively determined whether they survived their first moments. Remaining too close to water increased the risk of drowning or attack, while retreating inland demanded travel across terrain that now taxed the adult's endurance. Mothers carried heavier bodies that required more resources during pregnancy, extending the time needed for recovery and increasing the cost of failure. Each successful offspring represented a significant investment of energy and risk, and each loss carried greater weight for populations already strained by their environment. These reproductive pressures compounded the difficulties of daily survival, narrowing the margin within which populations could remain stable. This phase marked the most precarious stretch of the entire transition, not because transformation had advanced too far, but because it had not advanced enough. Bodies were no longer optimized for land, yet still poorly suited to water. Behavior required constant compromise, and success depended as much on circumstance as on adaptation. Many lineages entered this space and quietly disappeared, leaving behind only fragmented fossils that hint at paths that did not endure. Extinction during this interval was not dramatic. It unfolded through missed opportunities, exhausted bodies, and failed generations. The shoreline allowed persistence, but it did not guarantee it. Only those populations able to survive extended vulnerability, to endure imbalance without collapse, continued forward. For them, living between worlds was not a momentary challenge, but a prolonged test that shaped every aspect of their existence, setting the conditions under which further change could either continue or quietly end. As bodies continued their slow adjustment at the edge of water, sound became one of the first senses to reveal how deeply the transition disrupted familiar systems. On land, hearing depended on air carrying vibrations cleanly and predictably into the ear, where delicate bones translated pressure into meaning. This process worked effortlessly in open space, where sound traveled fast and maintained its shape. Near water, however, this reliability faded. Waves, splashes, and submerged moments bent sound in unfamiliar ways, compressing and scattering signals until direction and distance became harder to judge. For these early whale ancestors, moving repeatedly between air and water placed their hearing in constant conflict. What worked on land failed underwater, and what began to change for life near water weakened perception above the surface. Fossils from this period preserve subtle but important shifts in the bones surrounding the ear, changes that did not sharpen hearing but disturbed it. The structures responsible for transmitting vibration thickened and repositioned slightly, altering how sound passed inward. These alterations did not yet match the physics of water. Instead, they interfered with the clarity once available in air, softening sounds that once arrived sharp and distinct. This sensory disruption reshaped behavior in quiet ways. Reduced hearing efficiency meant that predators were harder to detect before they closed distance, and social calls lost precision as they traveled through mixed environments of wind and water. Signals that once guided movement and awareness arrived blurred or delayed, forcing greater reliance on sight and instinct. Near the shoreline, where visibility could vanish quickly beneath murky water or dense vegetation, this loss mattered deeply. Animals could no longer trust sound alone to map their surroundings. They adapted not by restoring hearing immediately, but by enduring its absence, adjusting patterns of movement to compensate. Time spent in shallow water increased gradually, where vibrations behaved differently, and where reduced hearing mattered less than it would have in open terrain. On land, caution grew. Movements slowed, pauses lengthened, and reliance on familiar routes increased, limiting exposure to surprise encounters. These behavioral shifts appear nowhere in bone, yet they are implied by the skeletal changes that made keen hearing more difficult and forced reliance on other strategies. Within the ear itself, transformation unfolded slowly and imperfectly. Bones thickened to withstand new pressures, while spaces that once amplified air-based sound began to change shape. The system moved away from optimal land hearing before acquiring the ability to interpret waterborne vibrations effectively. This stage represents not improvement, but loss. For long stretches of time, these animals heard less clearly than their fully terrestrial ancestors and far less effectively than their future aquatic descendants. The body tolerated this sensory compromise because survival still remained possible. The shoreline offered predictable terrain, repeated paths, and familiar rhythms that reduced the need for acute long-distance hearing. Danger was managed through proximity rather than detection, and communication relied more on closeness than clarity. Over generations, living with dulled hearing became part of the normal condition, shaping brains and behavior to function with incomplete information. What makes this phase remarkable is its imbalance. Evolution did not wait for hearing to improve before continuing its course. It allowed an essential sense to weaken temporarily, trusting that other changes would eventually make room for new forms of perception. The ear bones continued to shift incrementally, responding to pressures that came from repeated immersion and altered head positioning. Sound in water behaved as a dense, enveloping presence rather than a distant signal, and the structures that once filtered air vibrations began, slowly, to move toward this new reality. Yet during this interval, clarity remained elusive. Hearing neither served land nor water perfectly. It occupied an uncertain middle ground, reflecting a body still undecided, still transitioning. Through this prolonged sensory disruption, extinction remained a constant possibility. Animals that relied too heavily on hearing without adapting behavior likely disappeared quietly, leaving no dramatic trace. Those that endured learned to navigate a world where sound could not be fully trusted, building tolerance for uncertainty into daily life. In doing so, they carried forward another piece of transformation that arrived not as a gain, but as a sacrifice accepted early, long before its eventual reward became clear. As life at the shoreline drew these animals deeper into water more often and for longer stretches, breathing emerged as one of the most unforgiving limits of their bodies. Lungs built for land worked beautifully in open air, expanding and contracting with ease, exchanging gases without resistance, and relying on gravity to help keep airways clear. In water, those same lungs became fragile reservoirs that demanded careful timing and constant attention. Submersion turned breathing into a countdown. Each dive, however shallow, carried risk because the body could not yet store oxygen efficiently or control its use with precision. Water pressed against the chest, restricting expansion, while sudden movements or unexpected depths increased the chance of inhaling liquid instead of air. Repeated immersion amplified this danger, especially in turbulent shallows where footing slipped and waves disrupted balance. For animals whose instincts were still tuned to breathing whenever needed, the shift required restraint rather than effort. They had to learn not to breathe, to delay reflexes that had once been automatic, and this hesitation did not come easily or safely. Over time, behavior adapted first. These early whale ancestors limited how long they remained underwater, resurfacing often, favoring shallow zones where escape to air was always close. Their movements became rhythmic, coordinated with breathing cycles that shaped how they fed and traveled. Yet behavior alone could not resolve the constraint. Anatomy began to respond slowly, guided by repeated pressure rather than sudden innovation. Fossils record a gradual migration of the nasal openings along the skull, inching backward over immense spans of time. At first, these changes offered only marginal benefit. The nostrils shifted just enough to make breathing slightly easier, while the head floated at the surface, reducing the need to lift the entire face into the air. This small adjustment lowered energy costs and decreased exposure to danger during each breath, but it did not eliminate risk. Water could still enter the airway, and dives remained short. The transformation of breathing was not a clean solution, but a series of partial corrections, each one addressing a fraction of the problem while introducing new challenges elsewhere. The lungs themselves remained largely unchanged for millions of years, retaining their terrestrial structure while being asked to perform in an environment that punished error. Oxygen use stayed inefficient, limiting how deep or how long these animals could travel below the surface. Any surprise, a chase, a misjudged descent could end in suffocation. This vulnerability shaped survival in quiet ways. Individuals that mismanaged their breath did not leave descendants, while those that surfaced at the right moments, that paced their movements carefully, continued on. Over generations, the nervous system adapted alongside anatomy, refining control over breathing and delaying involuntary responses. Breath became something managed consciously by instinct, timed and rationed rather than freely taken. This shift altered daily life profoundly, turning water from a space of exploration into a space of discipline, where each movement was measured against the cost of air. The slow repositioning of nasal openings continued, guided by incremental advantage. As the opening migrated upward and backward, breathing at the surface required less disruption of forward motion. The head could remain mostly submerged, eyes scanning water ahead, while air entered through a pathway better protected from splashing waves. Yet even this improvement took enormous time to stabilize. Each small change depended on precise alignment of bones, soft tissues, and muscles, all of which rarely fossilized and had to evolve in coordination. Progress was uneven. Some lineages advanced slightly, others stalled or vanished. The fossil record captures this drawn-out refinement as a gentle arc rather than a leap, reminding us that breathing, the most basic act of life, became one of the hardest systems to adapt. During this phase, water remained an environment that demanded caution rather than confidence. Breathing constrained movement, limited ambition, and enforced shallow living. Still, persistence carried these animals forward. Each generation inherited marginally better control, marginally safer airways, and slightly reduced risk. It was enough to survive, though never comfortably, and survival alone allowed the long work of transformation to continue, breath by careful breath. As time spent in water lengthened, feeding emerged as another quiet constraint, one shaped by the simple fact that gravity no longer offered its familiar assistance. On land, swallowing relied on weight and positioning, on food moving downward through the throat, with little resistance once captured. Underwater, this effortless flow vanished. Food no longer fell where it was guided, and loose fragments drifted away with every movement. For animals accustomed to biting and chewing in air, this change demanded a complete rethinking of how prey was captured and consumed. Early attempts were inefficient and often wasteful. A successful bite did not guarantee a successful swallow, and energy spent chasing prey could be lost when food slipped free before it could be secured. This altered relationship between effort and reward reshaped feeding behavior gradually, encouraging slower, more deliberate movements that reduced turbulence and loss. Still, the body lagged behind these behavioral adjustments. Jaws and teeth, designed for firm bites against resistance, struggled to control prey in a medium that yielded and flowed around every motion. Within the skull, changes began to appear that hinted at a future solution. Jaw structures shifted subtly, not through dramatic reshaping, but through changes in joint alignment and muscle attachment that allowed the mouth to open wider and close with smoother control. These early modifications did not improve feeding immediately. Instead, they reduced precision, weakening bite force on land while offering only marginal benefit in water. Teeth followed a similar path of compromise. Sharp edges softened, spacing altered, and shapes became less specialized for cutting or crushing. These changes reduced efficiency when handling familiar land-based prey, while only beginning to accommodate a different strategy underwater. Feeding efficiency declined during this interval, not because prey disappeared, but because the body had not yet learned how to use water itself as a tool. The mouth opened and closed in a world where food drifted rather than resisted, and success depended increasingly on timing and positioning rather than strength alone. Gradually, suction began to emerge as a guiding principle. Rather than relying on teeth to grip and tear, the jaws started working in coordination with throat expansion, creating pressure differences that pulled prey inward. This approach required precise control of muscles and cavities that had never evolved for such coordination. Early suction was weak and inconsistent, often failing to hold prey securely once drawn in. Yet, even partial success offered an advantage, capturing small organisms more reliably than biting alone. Over generations, selection favored individuals that could create stronger, more controlled inward flow, using the surrounding water as part of the feeding mechanism. Teeth continued to change alongside this shift, becoming less about processing and more about guiding prey inward, preventing escape rather than inflicting damage. These adaptations unfolded slowly, intertwined with changes in skull shape and musculature that demanded careful balance. During this long adjustment, feeding remained energetically costly. More time and effort were required to secure enough nourishment, especially as movement remained inefficient and oxygen limited underwater. Failed feeding attempts accumulated quietly, shaping survival through subtle pressure rather than dramatic collapse. Those individuals that adapted behaviorally, feeding in calmer waters, targeting slower prey, or timing meals carefully, endured where others faded. Over time, improvements began to outpace losses. Suction grew more reliable, jaw control more refined, and teeth better suited to their changing role. Feeding efficiency slowly recovered, though it no longer resembled its terrestrial past. Instead, it became something new, anchored in the physics of water rather than the certainty of gravity. By enduring a long period of decline, these animals carried forward a transformation that would eventually allow feeding to occur with ease in a world where downward no longer meant anything at all. As the body continued its slow commitment to water, The limbs that once carried weight with confidence began to work against survival rather than support it. Legs that moved efficiently through air now met constant resistance, pushing water aside with every stroke and creating drag that slowed forward motion and wasted precious energy. Each kick and step stirred turbulence instead of momentum, making swimming laborious and imprecise. What once stabilized the body on land now disrupted its flow, forcing muscles to work harder for diminishing returns. Over time, the skeleton responded to this imbalance. Pelvic bones, which had once anchored powerful legs to the spine, began to shrink and loosen their attachment. Fossils reveal this change as a gradual fading rather than a sudden loss, with joints becoming less robust and connections weakening as generations passed. The pelvis no longer served as a central support for weight-bearing movement, and its role shifted towards something quieter and less essential. Legs followed the same path of quiet decline. They shortened, thinned, and lost the structural reinforcement needed for walking long distances or standing upright, yet they did not vanish immediately. For long spans of time, limbs remained present but purposeless, carried along by bodies that no longer relied on them. This stage reflects a profound imbalance. Limbs were still costly to grow and maintain, still requiring blood, muscle, and nerve control, yet they offered little benefit in water and increasing disadvantage on land. Movement became a careful negotiation between propulsion from the torso and the drag produced by trailing legs, and the body began favoring solutions that minimized resistance rather than amplified force. As pelvic connections weakened, posture changed subtly. The spine no longer aligned itself to support upright motion, instead becoming a flexible axis that allowed side-to-side movement to propagate more efficiently through water. This shift reduced the mechanical need for legs altogether, as propulsion increasingly came from waves traveling along the body rather than pushes from limbs. Fossil evidence captures this transition beautifully, showing limbs losing clear functional purpose before disappearing from external form. They persisted as remnants, present but no longer decisive, reflecting a body in the midst of letting go rather than abruptly abandoning a structure that had defined its ancestry. This loss unfolded slowly because each step away from land reduced the advantage of maintaining walking ability, while each improvement in swimming further weakened the case for return. The cost of reversal grew quietly. Rebuilding strong pelvic connections, re-strengthening limbs, and restoring upright posture would have required undoing multiple interacting changes at once. By this stage, adaptation had already closed many doors, even if the animal itself did not yet appear fully transformed. This period marked a profound narrowing of possibility. Although some time on land may still have occurred, it was no longer central or comfortable. Beaches and shorelines shifted from places of movement to places of rest, used briefly rather than occupied confidently. The body no longer belonged to solid ground, and each generation leaned further into water as the safer, more compatible environment. Limbs, once symbols of stability and independence, became liabilities that the body could not yet fully shed, but increasingly ignored. This was the point where commitment deepened without ceremony. There was no single generation where legs vanished or walking ended completely. Instead, there was a growing imbalance where returning to land demanded more from the body than staying in water. The fossil record preserves this moment not as an ending, but as a threshold where the architecture of life crossed into a form that could no longer easily turn back, carrying forward remnants of its past, even as its future flowed in a new direction. As bodies grew heavier and movement on land became increasingly strained, reproduction quietly followed the path of least resistance, drifting away from solid ground and toward the water that now shaped daily life. What had once been a stable and familiar setting for giving birth slowly turned impractical, not because land disappeared, but because the bodies returning to it no longer fit its demands. Heavier frames made hauling onto shore exhausting and risky, while weakened limbs and altered posture reduced stability at the very moments when balance mattered most. Labor required time and vulnerability, and on land that vulnerability expanded, exposed to predators, and constrained by bodies that no longer moved with confidence. Shallow water, by contrast, offered support without pressure. Buoyancy softened the strain of gravity, allowing pregnant bodies to float rather than bear full weight, and movement through water eased positions that would have been painful or impossible on solid ground. Gradually, birth shifted into this gentler medium, not as a dramatic relocation, but as a practical adjustment repeated over generations until it became the norm. Giving birth in water changed everything that followed. Newborns entered the world already surrounded by the environment they would depend on immediately, rather than being carried toward it after the fact. This shift demanded a level of readiness that land births had never required. Calves needed to surface for air almost at once, coordinate their movements, and remain close to their mothers in an environment where separation could be fatal within moments. There was no extended period of immobility, no prolonged resting phase after birth. Survival depended on immediate swimming ability, on instinctive motions that guided the young upward and kept them aligned with the adult body nearby. Fossil evidence cannot capture these first moments directly, yet the anatomy of later descendants reflects the outcome. Bodies developed in ways that favored rapid coordination at birth, with proportions and muscle readiness shaped by generations of newborns that either swam quickly or did not survive at all. The margin for error narrowed sharply, and with it came profound pressure on reproductive success. As calf survival became more demanding, maternal investment increased in quiet but far-reaching ways. Gestation lengthened, allowing offspring to develop further before birth, carrying more of the burden inside rather than risking weakness after delivery. Energy devoted to a single calf rose dramatically, as producing fewer, more capable young offered greater survival odds than producing many vulnerable ones. Mothers remained closely attached to their offspring for extended periods, guiding movement, regulating pace, and offering constant protection in a world where predators could approach from any direction. Milk composition shifted as well, becoming richer to support rapid growth in cold, demanding waters, though such details lie beyond fossil record and must be inferred from the bodies that persist today. What can be seen is the consequence. Skeletons reflect slower reproductive turnover and longer life histories, patterns that align with high parental investment and extended care. This transition reshaped social structure and behavior without any sudden shift in form. Breeding grounds emerged in calmer waters, where currents were predictable and threats easier to monitor. Migration patterns followed reproductive needs, carrying bodies toward environments where birth and early life could unfold with fewer interruptions. The water that once challenged survival now became the setting in which the most vulnerable moments occurred, reinforcing dependence on it at the deepest biological level. Returning to land to give birth grew not just difficult, but counterproductive, requiring strength, balance, and coordination that no longer defined the body. By moving reproduction offshore, these animals bound their future to water in a way that anatomy alone had not yet completed. Life began, quite literally, afloat, carried forward by generations of mothers whose investment ensured that the transition not only continued, but endured. As life settled more fully into water, temperature emerged as a constant and invisible force, shaping survival with quiet persistence. Water drew heat from the body far faster than air ever could, wrapping flesh in a cool pressure that never relented. On land, warmth lingered around fur and skin, and small shifts in posture or sunlight could restore balance. In water, heat slipped away steadily, carried off with every movement and every passing current. Early whales entered this world without one of the most important tools their descendants would later possess. They lacked thick layers of insulating fat, relying instead on bodies that had evolved to hold warmth and air rather than defend it against immersion. Time spent in cooler waters shortened, not by choice but by necessity. Foraging, travel, and rest all became constrained by the need to return to warmer shallows or surface conditions before heat loss drained strength and coordination. This limitation did not end the transition, but it narrowed it, guiding where these animals could live and when they could move. Warm coastal zones became refuges where the thermal cost of water remained manageable, while colder regions stayed beyond reach, not because food was absent, but because survival there demanded insulation the body had not yet learned to grow. This thermal pressure shaped distribution slowly but decisively. Early whale populations clustered in warmer latitudes, following currents and seasons that offered relative comfort rather than abundance alone. Migration patterns emerged cautiously, bounded by temperature rather than distance, and extended exposure to colder water carried escalating risk. Heat loss weakened muscles, slowed reactions, and magnified the dangers already present in inefficient movement and limited oxygen use. Over time, small variations in body composition began to matter more. Individuals with slightly higher fat reserves retained warmth longer, extending their active periods and reducing recovery time between dives. These advantages accumulated quietly across generations. Fat, once merely a storage tissue, began to serve a second purpose, forming layers beneath the skin that slowed the escape of heat into surrounding water. This accumulation did not happen suddenly, nor evenly across the body. It thickened gradually, guided by physiology and selection, reshaping outlines and smoothing forms in ways that would eventually define the whale's silhouette. As insulation improved, geographic limits expanded. Cooler waters became tolerable, then accessible, opening new feeding grounds and reducing competition in warmer zones. The body responded to these expanding opportunities by investing further in insulation, reinforcing a cycle where thermal control enabled movement, and movement rewarded better thermal control. Over long spans of time, this process altered more than temperature regulation alone. Increased fat deposits changed buoyancy, energy storage, and streamlining, integrating with other ongoing adaptations in swimming and metabolism. Body shape shifted permanently, rounding and enlarging in ways that favored life immersed rather than life ashore. What began as a response to cold became a defining feature of identity, anchoring these animals firmly within the ocean environment. Heat, once an invisible constraint, transformed into a guide that directed evolution with patience rather than force, ensuring that as whales moved outward into a broader world, they carried warmth with them, sealed beneath their skin, ready for depths and distances that had once been impossible. As bodies adapted to water in structure and temperature, vision lagged behind, challenged by a world where light no longer behaved as it once had. Eyes, shaped for air, struggled beneath the surface, where brightness faded quickly and clarity dissolved into shifting gradients of blue and green. On land, light traveled cleanly and predictably, carrying sharp outlines and reliable depth cues. Underwater, It scattered, bent, and dimmed with distance, its intensity shaped by depth, particles, and movement. Early whale ancestors entered this visual environment without the tools to interpret it well. Their eyes, positioned and proportioned for scanning horizons and tracking motion across solid ground, found little certainty beneath the surface. Objects appeared closer than they were, edges softened, and contrast weakened. What had once been a dependable sense became inconsistent, forcing these animals to rely less on sight and more on touch, timing, and memory as they navigated shallow waters. Vision did not vanish, but it lost authority, becoming a secondary guide rather than a dominant one. This struggle shaped behavior long before anatomy caught up. Time spent underwater often remained brief, not only due to breathing limits, but because visual uncertainty increased risk. Murky shallows and coastal waters offered little depth perception, and sudden changes in light caused by waves or surface glare further complicated perception. Early whales learned to move cautiously, favoring environments where visual demands were reduced, such as calm, sediment rich waters where reliance on sight mattered less than familiarity with terrain. Over generations, eyes began to change, though slowly and unevenly. Fossils suggest subtle shifts in eye placement along the skull, not dramatic relocations, but gradual repositioning that altered how much of the surrounding world could be seen while swimming near the surface. Eyes moved slightly higher and outward, allowing a wider field of view without requiring the head to lift fully into air. This adjustment improved awareness above and below the surface simultaneously, but it did little to solve the deeper problem of underwater clarity. Structural changes within the eye followed a similarly patient pace. Shapes adjusted to accommodate differences in focus between air and water, yet during much of this period, no single environment was served well. Vision in air declined as eyes adapted away from terrestrial precision, while underwater vision remained limited until other systems fully aligned with aquatic life. The lens and cornea, so finely tuned for land, faced conflicting demands, and each small shift represented compromise rather than optimization. This meant that for long stretches of time, early whales lived with imperfect sight in both worlds, navigating through partial information and adapting behavior to compensate. Movements slowed, paths grew familiar, and feeding strategies favored close-range encounters where vision mattered less than proximity. The shoreline once again buffered this imbalance, offering environments where limited sight did not immediately lead to failure. Only after full aquatic commitment did vision begin to improve meaningfully. As bodies abandoned land and ceased dividing time between realms, selection could finally refine the eye for a single medium. Depth tolerance expanded, light sensitivity increased, and visual processing aligned more closely with life underwater. These changes unfolded alongside other sensory adaptations, integrating vision into a broader suite of tools suited for the ocean rather than the shore. Improved underwater vision did not restore the sharp clarity of land sight. Instead, it produced a different form of awareness, one attuned to motion, contrast, and subtle shifts in brightness rather than fine detail. Eye placement settled into positions that supported streamlined movement and surface breathing, completing a transformation that had begun with uncertainty and compromise. Vision, like so many other systems in this story, did not lead the transition. It followed it, slowly reshaped by commitment rather than curiosity, finding its place only after the path forward had already been chosen. As bodies committed more fully to water, one of the quietest necessities of life became one of its most delicate problems. Sleep, so effortless on land, transformed into a state that demanded constant management. Land mammals surrender fully during sleep, allowing muscles to relax and awareness to fade, trusting solid ground and open air to keep them safe. In water, this surrender carried risk. Unconsciousness meant loss of posture, loss of breathing control, and the slow certainty of drowning if the body failed to surface in time. Early whales did not possess a built in solution to this challenge. Their nervous systems were still wired for complete rest, cycles shaped by a world where falling asleep did not threaten life itself. As time and water increased, sleep could no longer be separated from survival. It had to change, not through comfort, but through necessity, becoming lighter, fragmented, and carefully timed around breathing and buoyancy. Rest occurred in brief intervals near the surface, in calm waters where drifting carried less danger, or close to shorelines where recovery could happen quickly. These patterns were not efficient, but they allowed survival during a period when anatomy offered no safeguards. For long spans of evolutionary time, this problem remained unresolved. Fossils offer no direct record of sleep, yet the absence of certain adaptations in earlier forms suggests that for millions of years, whales lived with imperfect solutions. Their bodies were increasingly aquatic, yet their need for unconscious rest remained unchanged. This mismatch shaped behavior in subtle ways. Groups may have lingered in protected areas, favoring shallow waters or slow currents where passive floating reduced risk during rest. Sleep likely came in short episodes, scattered through day and night, rather than deep, uninterrupted periods. Exhaustion became part of the cost of transition, adding strain to bodies already taxed by inefficient movement and sensory limitations. Only later, after many other systems had settled into aquatic life, did sleep itself begin to adapt at a deeper level. Modern whales display a remarkable solution, one that allows rest without complete surrender. Unihemispheric sleep permits one half of the brain to rest while the other remains alert, maintaining breathing, posture, and awareness of surroundings. This state allows the body to surface regularly for air and respond to changes in environment even while partially asleep. Yet fossil evidence and comparative anatomy suggest that this adaptation emerged late after the transition to full aquatic life was already complete. It was not an early enabler, but a refinement. Arriving once returning to land was no longer possible, and continuous immersion demanded a more sustainable form of rest. This timing reinforces a broader pattern seen throughout the story. Critical systems often broke before they were repaired, leaving bodies to endure long periods of vulnerability before solutions took hold. Sleep followed the same path, remaining dangerous until evolution found a way to split awareness itself. The emergence of this divided rest reshaped daily rhythms and social behavior. Whales could remain mobile while resting, drifting slowly or swimming gently as part of a group, relying on shared movement and spacing to reduce risk. Mothers could remain attentive to calves even during rest, maintaining contact and guidance without full wakefulness. The ocean, once a place where sleep threatened life, became an environment where rest and motion intertwined. This adaptation did not make sleep identical to its terrestrial past. It changed its nature entirely, transforming rest from a complete shutdown into a controlled dimming of consciousness. Sleep without drowning became possible not through retreat or avoidance, but through a fundamental reworking of how awareness itself could be divided. In this quiet and deeply internal change, whales completed another step in their long commitment to water, carrying forward a solution that allowed life to continue uninterrupted even when the mind finally let itself rest. As the transition unfolded across immense spans of time, survival was never evenly distributed, and most attempts quietly ended without leaving a lasting mark. For every lineage that continued forward, many others faded along the way, their stories incomplete, and their bodies preserved only in fragments or not at all. The fossil record reflects this imbalance through absence more than presence. Long gaps appear where related forms should exist, stretches of time where experimentation clearly occurred, yet no descendants carried those designs forward. These gaps are not accidents of geology alone. They represent repeated failures, moments when bodies entered transitional states but could not endure the combined pressures of movement, breathing, feeding, reproduction, temperature, and perception. Early whale relatives often advanced partway into aquatic life, acquiring some adaptations while still burdened by others that no longer worked well. When circumstances shifted even slightly, changes in climate, prey availability, or predator presence, these partially adapted forms lacked the flexibility to respond. Survival demanded coordination across many systems at once, and improving one trait without stabilizing others often proved fatal over time. The shoreline environment allowed persistence, but it did not promise success. Each adaptive step introduced new costs that narrowed margins further. Bodies became heavier before becoming efficient swimmers. Hearing weakened before it adapted to water. Limbs lost usefulness before they disappeared. Sleep grew dangerous long before safe solutions emerged. At every stage, lineages faced bottlenecks where survival depended on enduring vulnerability for extended periods. Many did not. Fossil evidence suggests repeated branching and collapse, waves of diversification followed by disappearance, leaving behind isolated bones that hint at paths not taken to completion. These extinctions rarely appear dramatic. They did not require sudden catastrophe or dramatic shifts in the environment. More often, they unfolded quietly through reduced reproduction, increased juvenile mortality, and gradual population decline. A lineage could persist for thousands of generations and still vanish, undone by the accumulation of small disadvantages that never fully resolved. What makes this pattern striking is how narrow the successful path appears in hindsight. The whales we know today represent a single branch that managed to cross every bottleneck in sequence, not because each step was optimal, but because none became fatal at the wrong moment. This does not imply inevitability. The fossil record offers no sign that success was guaranteed or even likely. Instead, it suggests that the transition demanded an unusual tolerance for prolonged inefficiency. Lineages that failed often did so not because they lacked a key adaptation, but because too many systems remained compromised at once. Survival required alignment across movement, feeding, breathing, reproduction, sensory perception, and temperature control, all while facing predators and environmental change. Missing even one of these alignments for too long could end a lineage completely. These unseen extinctions shape the story as deeply as the survivors do. They remind us that evolution is not a ladder steadily climbed, but a landscape filled with dead ends and abandoned routes. Progress carried a cost paid in silence, written into gaps rather than bones. The whales that endured did not escape these pressures. They simply passed through them without collapsing, one narrow threshold at a time. Their existence today carries within it the weight of countless lost experiments, bodies that leaned toward the water but never fully arrived. Survival, in this case, was not a reward for boldness or speed, but for persistence through vulnerability, for remaining viable long enough for broken systems to eventually repair. The extinctions we do not see are not failures of imagination. They are the hidden foundation beneath every surviving lineage, shaping what life became by removing everything that could not endure the long, uneven path forward. By the time this stage was reached, the body had quietly crossed a threshold that no longer allowed compromise. What had once been a form capable of moving between environments was now shaped almost entirely by water, and the consequences of that shaping were written clearly into the skeleton. The spine, which had gradually loosened to allow waves of motion to travel from head to tail, no longer held itself in the rigid alignment required for upright posture. Flexibility had become its defining feature. Each vertebra contributed to a smooth, continuous curve that transmitted force efficiently through water, but this same fluidity erased the stability needed to stand or walk. Gravity no longer met resistance in the familiar way. Instead of locking into place, the body folded and shifted, muscles working constantly just to prevent collapse. Upright posture ceased to be a natural resting state and became an exhausting act of balance that the body was no longer organized to maintain. The shoulders reflected this transition with equal clarity. Joints that once faced forward to support weight and control stride rotated outward, loosening their attachment to the spine and changing the direction of force they could apply. On land, this rotation reduced strength and precision, making it difficult to brace against the ground or lift the torso effectively. The arms no longer functioned as stabilizing supports, and attempts to push or pull against solid surfaces yielded little control. In water, however, these same changes allowed the limbs to align with the body's length, reducing resistance and integrating movement into the broader flow created by the spine. The shoulders no longer served gravity, they served motion. This shift marked the disappearance of weight-bearing capacity across the body as a whole. Hips no longer transferred load from spine to legs, knees no longer locked to support mass, and feet no longer met the ground with purpose. Each structure still existed, but their cooperation had dissolved. Without a coordinated framework to distribute weight, the body simply could not function on land. As a result, land transformed from a habitat into an obstacle. Reaching shore required extraordinary effort for minimal benefit, and once there, the body had no meaningful way to move, feed, or escape. Limbs could not lift the body efficiently, posture could not be maintained, and balance demanded constant exertion. What had once been a place of rest and recovery now offered none. Selection followed this reality without hesitation. Any variation that favored terrestrial capability no longer improved survival, because survival no longer occurred there. Water provided food, reproduction, movement, and safety, while land offered strain and vulnerability. Over generations, the body reorganized fully around this truth, reinforcing flexibility, streamlining, and continuous motion through a medium that supported rather than resisted its mass. This moment did not arrive suddenly or dramatically. There was no single ancestor that stood on land for the last time and never returned. Instead, land became irrelevant through a steady accumulation of structural changes that made return increasingly difficult, then impractical, and finally impossible. The body did not reject land by choice. It simply lost the physical means to exist there. From this point forward, the transition was no longer a process of becoming aquatic. It had already happened. What remained were refinements within water, not reconsiderations of life beyond it. The body had crossed a point where gravity no longer defined its form, and solid ground faded into memory, preserved only in altered bones that no longer remembered how to carry weight. As the body fully abandoned land as a functional space, movement reorganized itself around a single, decisive solution, one that transformed the way force traveled through flesh and bone. The tail, once a secondary feature used for balance and subtle steering, began to assume the role of primary propulsion, quietly taking over the labor that limbs could no longer perform. This shift did not occur overnight, but it arrived with clarity. Waves of motion that once dissipated through flexible spines and inefficient limbs now concentrated toward the rear of the body, where muscle mass increased and coordination sharpened. Vertebrae along the spine elongated and strengthened, particularly toward the tail, forming a continuous chain capable of transferring power smoothly and repeatedly through water. Each segment contributed to a traveling wave, starting near the shoulders and rolling backward with growing intensity, converting muscular effort into forward thrust. This movement matched the physics of water rather than resisting it, allowing the body to push against density instead of drag through it. Over time, this pattern replaced all others. Limbs no longer defined direction or speed. The tail did. As vertebrae adapted, their joints reinforced flexibility in specific directions while limiting motion that wasted energy. Side to side bending became fluid and controlled, while vertical movement faded, aligning the spine with the most efficient path through water. Muscles thickened around these elongated bones, anchoring themselves in arrangements that favored endurance as much as power. Propulsion no longer relied on short bursts of effort, but on sustained, rhythmic motion that could be maintained over long distances without exhaustion. With this change, the tail ceased to be an appendage and became an engine. Steering and balance followed naturally from this design, with subtle adjustments in amplitude and timing, guiding turns and depth changes without disrupting forward motion. The body no longer fought the water, it worked with it, flowing rather than forcing. From this foundation, a new structure emerged that signaled the completion of aquatic locomotion. Horizontal tail flukes developed at the tail's end, expanding the surface area available for pushing against water. Unlike fishtails, which often move side to side alone, these flukes worked in concert with the entire body wave, amplifying thrust while maintaining stability. Their horizontal orientation aligned with the whale's breathing needs, allowing powerful movement without forcing the head downward or upward unpredictably. Fossil evidence traces the gradual widening and shaping of these flukes, not as a sudden invention, but as a refinement of tissue and bone, responding to repeated demand. With flukes in place, propulsion became both efficient and precise. Speed increased, maneuverability improved, and energy costs declined. What had once been an exhausting act of survival transformed into a confident mode of travel. This moment marked true aquatic locomotion, not because every system had reached perfection, but because movement was finally unified under a design that favored water alone. The tail carried the full responsibility of propulsion, freeing the rest of the body to specialize further. Limbs reduced their role to steering or vanished into the body entirely. The spine no longer balanced competing demands. It served a single purpose, transmitting force forward through liquid space. From this point on, evolution could refine rather than compensate. Adjustments became improvements instead of repairs. Distance expanded as a possibility, opening pathways into deeper water and wider ranges. With the tail in command, the body crossed another threshold, one that confirmed its commitment to the ocean not just as a place to exist, but as a medium to master through motion itself. As propulsion consolidated in the tail and the body's relationship with land faded into distance, the final remnants of walking began their quiet retreat, not erased by necessity, but slowly diminished by irrelevance. Hind limbs, once central to movement and balance, shrank generation by generation, their bones growing smaller as their purpose dissolved. They no longer anchored muscles that pushed against ground or stabilized posture under gravity. Instead, They became internal features, tucked deep within the body, disconnected from the spine, and unable to influence motion in any meaningful way. Fossils reveal this change as a long taper rather than an abrupt loss. Early forms still carried recognizable limb bones, reduced but present, while later forms show only small, isolated structures buried within muscle and connective tissue. These bones did not vanish because they were harmful. They persisted because removing them entirely offered no advantage, and because development still followed ancient instructions written long before the ocean reshaped the body's needs. Evolution is often economical, but it is rarely tidy. When a structure no longer interferes, it may remain, quiet and unused, carried forward as a shadow of former function. Over time, these hind limb remnants lost all mechanical role. They did not contribute to swimming, balance, or reproduction. They did not connect to joints capable of movement, nor did they support muscles that generated force. Yet they remained biologically real, still forming during development, still responding faintly to genetic signals inherited from terrestrial ancestors. In modern whales, these bones persist as small pelvic elements, hidden from view, disconnected from any limb that could touch the ground. Their presence does not aid survival, but it does not hinder it either. They exist as a physical memory, a record etched into anatomy that speaks silently of a different way of life. Unlike scars, which fade as healing completes, these remnants endure because there was never a moment when erasing them mattered. The body had moved on, but the blueprint retained echoes of its past. This persistence tells an important story about how transitions complete themselves. Walking did not end with a dramatic loss of limbs or a sudden break from land. It ended when walking no longer mattered. Once movement, feeding, reproduction, and survival all occurred in water, the selective pressure to maintain terrestrial structures disappeared. At that point, evolution focused on refining what worked rather than eliminating what did not. The last traces of walking were left behind not out of failure, but because they were no longer relevant to success. Their continued presence reflects the slow pace at which deep biological change resolves, especially when the past poses no obstacle to the future. These internal bones became anatomical fossils within living bodies, preserving history without influencing function. For those who study whales today, these remnants offer rare continuity across deep time. They connect animals that swim across entire oceans to ancestors that once stood on riverbanks and floodplains. They remind us that the transition was not clean or perfect, but layered, carrying earlier stages forward even as new ones took hold. Anatomy does not forget easily. It remembers in small ways, in structures that linger long after their purpose has passed. In this final shedding of walking, the body did not erase its origin. It archived it. The last traces of limbs remain embedded within modern whales as quiet evidence of a path taken fully, but never completely forgotten, preserved not in behavior or environment, but in bone itself, where deep time leaves its most enduring signatures. With bodies now shaped entirely by water and freed from the need to touch land, movement gradually stretched beyond the shelter of coastlines and into the open ocean, a space once inaccessible both physically and biologically. Coastal dependence faded not through abandonment, but through widening confidence. The same adaptations that had made shallow waters survivable now made deeper waters possible. Propulsion no longer faltered with distance. Breathing and temperature were managed with greater control, and navigation no longer relied on familiar shorelines. Whales began to move outward, following gradients of food rather than the contours of land, entering regions where the seafloor fell away and the surface stretched uninterrupted in every direction. This transition unfolded slowly, guided by opportunity rather than urgency. Nearshore environments remained productive, but beyond them lay vast volumes of water filled with life that had never been accessible before. Schools of fish moved through deeper layers, squid drifted and migrated vertically, and entire ecosystems existed far from land, rising and sinking with daily rhythms of light and darkness. For whales capable of sustained swimming and efficient travel, these resources represented a quiet expansion of possibility. As whales ventured farther from shore, new feeding strategies continued to refine themselves. The ability to travel long distances allowed them to track prey that was mobile rather than fixed, opening access to food sources that appeared briefly and vanished just as quickly. Deep water demanded endurance and navigation rather than territorial familiarity, and bodies adapted accordingly. Longer migrations became possible, tying movement to seasonal shifts and global patterns rather than local geography. With distance came safety as well. Many predators that haunted shallow waters did not follow into the open ocean, and the sheer scale of the environment reduced encounters that once shaped survival near shore. This change in risk further encouraged outward movement, reinforcing the advantages of deeper, less crowded spaces. Over time, whales came to inhabit regions where land played no role at all, becoming creatures defined not by boundaries, but by volume. In this expanded world, size began to matter in new ways. Larger bodies retained heat more efficiently, stored oxygen longer, and traveled farther with less relative effort. Growth offered stability in an environment where distance replaced shelter as the primary challenge. As food availability increased and competition shifted, selection favored individuals that grew larger over generations. This was not sudden gigantism, but a steady scaling upward, supported by abundant prey and efficient movement. Larger size also reduced vulnerability, placing many whales beyond the reach of most predators and allowing longer dives that accessed deeper food layers. The ocean rewarded mass when paired with mobility, and whales responded by becoming some of the largest animals ever to exist. Their size reshaped ecosystems, influencing nutrient movement through feeding and waste, and altering the structure of marine communities across vast regions. This expansion into the open ocean marked a profound shift in identity. Whales were no longer coastal mammals that tolerated water. They became fully oceanic beings, woven into global systems of circulation and life. Their movements connected distant regions, carrying energy from deep waters to the surface and across latitudes. The sea, once an obstacle, became their domain. By moving outward and growing larger, whales completed the transition from shoreline experiment to ocean presence, establishing themselves as inhabitants of the planet's largest living space. The open ocean did not simply receive them, it shaped them in return, offering scale, depth, and abundance, and in doing so, confirmed that the long commitment to water had opened not just a new habitat, but an entirely new way of belonging to Earth. As whales moved fully into the open ocean and distances stretched far beyond the shelter of coasts, size began to reshape survival in ways that no other trait could match. Large bodies held heat more steadily, slowing the constant drain imposed by cold water and allowing whales to remain active for longer periods without retreat. Thermal stability became less dependent on immediate conditions and more embedded in the body itself, as mass reduced surface area relative to volume and insulated warmth deep within muscle and fat. This stability supported longer migrations, deeper dives, and expanded ranges, freeing whales from the narrow bands of temperature that once constrained their ancestors. With size came calm endurance, a body less reactive to short term fluctuations and more suited to the slow rhythms of the open sea. Heat loss, once a persistent threat, faded into the background, no longer dictating where life could unfold. Predation risk shifted just as dramatically. In coastal waters, vulnerability had shaped behavior at every moment, but in the open ocean, increasing size altered the balance entirely. Few predators could challenge a fully grown whale, and encounters that once ended in flight now passed without consequence. Size itself became a form of protection, reducing the need for constant vigilance and allowing energy to be invested elsewhere. Calves still required care, but even they benefited from the shelter of massive bodies nearby. As predation pressure dropped, survival favored not speed or stealth, but longevity. Longer lifespans allowed more reproductive opportunities and supported slower, more deliberate growth strategies. The ocean rewarded those who could persist rather than those who could evade, and whales answered by growing larger still. Oxygen storage improved alongside size, reshaping how whales interacted with depth and time. Larger bodies held greater volumes of blood and muscle capable of storing oxygen, extending dive duration without increasing effort. This capacity opened access to deeper food sources and allowed whales to exploit layers of the ocean that smaller bodies could not reach safely. Dives became longer and more efficient, reducing the frequency of surfacing and lowering energy costs over distance. Scale turned depth from a barrier into an opportunity, integrating oxygen management with movement, feeding, and exploration. What had once been a rigid limit now became a flexible boundary, expanding gradually as bodies grew. Through these changes, gigantism emerged not as excess, but as strategy. Growing large was not about dominance or spectacle. It was a solution to multiple challenges at once, combining thermal control, safety, endurance, and efficiency into a single, reinforcing design. The ocean, vast and often empty, favored organisms that could travel far, store resources, and remain stable across time and space. Whales met these demands by increasing in size steadily, each generation pushing the limits set by the previous one. This growth did not erase vulnerability entirely, but it shifted the terms of survival profoundly. Where earlier stages had required constant negotiation with risk, size allowed a measure of confidence, a body capable of absorbing uncertainty rather than reacting to it. In becoming giants, whales did not abandon the adaptations that had carried them this far. They refined them. Thermal insulation thickened, oxygen storage deepened, and movement became more economical with scale. Gigantism integrated seamlessly into the story already unfolding, reinforcing commitments made long before the first truly large bodies appeared. It marked a culmination rather than a departure, a moment when the ocean's demands and the whale's form aligned fully. By growing large, whales did not merely survive the open ocean, they came to embody it, their size reflecting the vastness of the world they now inhabited, carrying the long history of their transition forward within bodies built for distance, depth, and time itself. As whales settled fully into the open ocean and distance replaced shoreline as the dominant feature of their world, sound became the most reliable thread holding individuals together within that vastness. Water carried sound far more efficiently than air, allowing vibrations to travel immense distances with clarity and persistence, slipping through darkness and bending around bodies and terrain with ease. What had once been a weakened and unreliable sense during earlier stages of the transition now expanded into a primary channel of awareness. Vocalizations grew longer, deeper, and more varied, shaped not only by anatomy but by experience and learning. Low frequencies rolled slowly through the ocean, reaching others far beyond visual range, while higher tones carried detail and immediacy across shorter distances. These sounds were no longer accidental expressions. Over time, they organized themselves into recognizable patterns that conveyed identity, location, and movement, allowing whales to announce their presence and orientation even when separated by kilometers of open water. Communication no longer depended on sight or proximity. It flowed constantly, filling the ocean with information that transformed how individuals understood their surroundings. As vocal complexity increased, social coordination shifted in quiet but powerful ways. Groups no longer needed to remain tightly packed to function as cohesive units. Instead, they stretched and contracted fluidly, held together by shared sound rather than physical closeness. Mothers and calves relied on familiar calls to remain connected in moving water, using sound as an anchor when currents and depth obscured everything else. Individuals learned to recognize one another through voice, allowing relationships to persist across time and distance rather than requiring constant contact. Vocal learning became an essential part of development as younger whales shaped their calls in response to those around them, gradually matching the acoustic patterns of their group. This process embedded identity within sound itself, creating social bonds reinforced through shared vocal traditions. Over generations, these patterns stabilized into group-specific styles of communication, not fixed scripts, but recognizable ways of sounding that reflected shared history and movement through the same waters. Behavior followed this acoustic transformation. Travel became coordinated through sound rather than sight, allowing whales to align direction and speed even when spread across wide areas. Feeding strategies improved as individuals responded collectively to vocal signals that marked opportunity or change, concentrating effort where it mattered most. Migration routes stabilized as information traveled ahead of bodies, allowing groups to adjust gradually rather than react suddenly. Communication reduced uncertainty in an environment defined by depth and distance, turning isolation into connection and randomness into shared response. The ocean itself transformed through this change, becoming an acoustic landscape dense with overlapping signals, pauses, and echoes, each carrying meaning. Whales no longer moved as solitary bodies navigating emptiness, but as distributed communities bound together by continuous exchange. Sound reshaped group structure, behavior, and memory, allowing cooperation to emerge without centralized control and stability to persist across shifting conditions. In learning to speak across water, whales adapted not just to the ocean's scale, but to one another, weaving social life into a world defined by vastness, depth, and vibration. As whales continued to expand across the open ocean, abundance did not push them all in the same direction. Instead, opportunity created divergence, and from within a shared body plan, two distinct feeding paths slowly took shape. One lineage remained centered on teeth and hunting, refining the skills required to chase, capture, and subdue individual prey. These whales adapted their jaws, teeth, and sensory coordination to pursue fish, squid, and other fast-moving animals that occupied deeper layers of the sea. Speed, precision, and timing shaped their survival. Their teeth remained prominent, gripping rather than cutting, arranged to hold slippery prey rather than tear flesh apart. Hunting became an exercise in coordination between movement and perception, with bodies designed to accelerate, turn sharply, and dive repeatedly in pursuit of scattered targets. For these whales, food was something to be found, followed, and secured through active effort. Success depended on the ability to locate prey within vast volumes of water and convert motion into capture efficiently. At the same time, another lineage began responding to a very different opportunity, one defined not by pursuit but by density. In certain regions of the ocean, small organisms gathered in extraordinary numbers, forming clouds of life that drifted with currents and seasons. These tiny prey were too numerous to chase individually, but together they represented an immense source of energy. For whales encountering this abundance, hunting became inefficient. Teeth that once helped capture prey now limited intake, allowing only small amounts of food to pass at a time. Slowly, a different solution emerged. Teeth began to reduce, losing prominence and structural importance, while the mouth widened and expanded to accommodate large volumes of water. This lineage shifted away from precision toward intake, evolving a feeding strategy that relied on engulfing rather than grasping. Over long stretches of time, teeth disappeared entirely, replaced by flexible plates of baleen that hung from the upper jaw like curtains. These plates filtered food from water, trapping tiny organisms while allowing liquid to escape. Feeding no longer required pursuit or speed. It depended instead on access to dense prey fields and the ability to process enormous quantities of water efficiently. This divergence reshaped not only anatomy, but behavior and ecology as well. Toothed whales continued to diversify as hunters, occupying roles similar to predators on land, each species refining its approach to prey capture based on size, depth, and environment. Baleen whales, by contrast, grew increasingly specialized for bulk feeding, timing their movements to seasonal blooms and migrations of small organisms. Their size increased dramatically as filtering rewarded mass, with larger mouths capturing more food and larger bodies storing energy over long periods of scarcity. These two strategies coexisted because the ocean supported both, offering niches that did not compete directly with one another. Together, they expanded the range of what whales could be, transforming a single evolutionary story into a branching network of solutions shaped by water, prey, and scale. Feeding strategies diversified not as experiments, but as responses to opportunity, each path refining itself over millions of years. In this divergence, whales demonstrated the flexibility that had defined their journey from the beginning, showing that even within a shared origin, life could follow radically different paths while remaining bound to the same vast and patient ocean. By the time whales had fully adapted to life in open water, the possibility of returning to land had quietly disappeared, not through a single dramatic loss, but through the accumulation of many small, interlocking changes that no longer aligned with a terrestrial world. Returning to land would not have required a simple adjustment or behavioral shift. It would have demanded the rebuilding of entire systems that had been gradually dismantled over millions of years. Upright posture would need to be restored in a spine reshaped for lateral motion. Weight-bearing joints would need to reattach and strengthen after generations of disuse. Limbs would need to regain length, leverage, and coordination capable of supporting mass against gravity. Breathing systems optimized for long dives and controlled surfacing would need to abandon their new rhythms and return to constant air intake. Temperature regulation would need to function without the buffering support of water and thick insulation. Reproduction would need to move back onto solid ground, requiring bodies and behaviors no longer shaped for that context. Each of these changes depended on the others, forming a network of requirements that could not be satisfied in isolation. Without all of them changing together, none of them could work at all. The fossil record reflects this permanence with striking clarity. At no point after whales became fully aquatic does evidence suggest a lineage reversing course. No skeletons appear that show a gradual rebuilding of walking limbs. No intermediate forms point toward renewed terrestrial capability, and no anatomical compromises hint at a return to land based life. Instead, the record shows continued refinement in a single direction, deeper commitment to aquatic movement, feeding, and survival. Once certain thresholds were crossed, especially the loss of weight bearing capacity and the restructuring of the spine and limbs, the path behind closed completely. Evolution did not circle back to explore old options. It moved forward along the only route still available. This was not because land had become uninhabitable, but because whales had become incompatible with it. Their success in water removed any selective pressure to relearn terrestrial life, while simultaneously increasing the cost of attempting it. Evolution tends to lock in changes once they integrate deeply across the body. Thresholds matter not because they are dramatic, but because they reorganize how traits depend on one another. In whales, locomotion, breathing, reproduction, feeding, and sensory systems all became linked to water in ways that could not be separated. Altering one without destabilizing the rest became increasingly unlikely. Any mutation that might have favored land movement no longer conferred advantage because survival, feeding, and reproduction all occurred elsewhere. Selection reinforced aquatic traits relentlessly, not out of preference, but because they worked. Over time, what began as adaptation became dependence. Water was no longer an environment whales tolerated or exploited occasionally. It became the only place where their bodies functioned as complete systems. This permanence reshaped the meaning of the transition itself. The movement from land to sea was not a temporary experiment or a reversible gamble. It was a one-way transformation where each successful step forward reduced the possibility of stepping back. Whales did not choose this outcome, and evolution did not plan it. It emerged naturally from the way traits interact over deep time, from the way improvement in one context creates incompatibility with another. By the time whales spread across the open ocean, grew to immense sizes, and communicated across vast distances, the idea of land had become purely historical. It lived on in vestigial bones, in patterns of development, and in echoes written into anatomy, but not in function or possibility. The transition had become permanent, not because of a single irreversible change, but because so many changes aligned in the same direction that turning back would have required starting over entirely. In this way, whales became living proof that evolution does not always preserve options. Sometimes it commits fully, carrying life forward into a future that cannot return to its past. Long after the transition from land was complete, its consequences began to reach far beyond the bodies of whales themselves, extending outward into the structure and function of entire oceans. Modern whales do not simply live within marine ecosystems. They actively shape them through their presence, movement, and basic biological processes. Feeding at depth and returning to the surface, whales transport nutrients vertically through the water column, carrying elements locked deep below back into sunlit layers where life can use them again. This slow, repeated motion acts like a living circulation system, redistributing material that would otherwise remain isolated in the dark. Microscopic organisms respond almost immediately to this enrichment, multiplying in areas where whales pass regularly, forming the foundation of food webs that support fish, invertebrates, and countless other forms of life. In this way, the simple act of breathing air while feeding underwater becomes a mechanism that enhances productivity across vast regions. The ocean grows more fertile not by chance, but because large bodies move through it with regularity, linking depths to surfaces through daily and seasonal rhythms. The movement of whales across oceans also reshapes life horizontally, not just vertically. Migration routes trace paths of energy flow, as nutrients released in one region are carried into another by bodies traveling thousands of kilometers. These routes become corridors of life, where plankton blooms intensify and fish gather in greater numbers, responding to conditions created indirectly by the passage of whales. Even after whales move on, their influence lingers, altering chemical balances and biological activity long enough to affect entire communities. Carcasses that sink to the seafloor create islands of nourishment in otherwise sparse environments, sustaining specialized ecosystems for years or even decades. These deep sea communities exist entirely because large whales lived, fed, and eventually died above them. Without the mass and mobility whales achieved through their aquatic evolution, such ecological links would not exist. The ocean would still function, but it would function differently, with less connectivity between layers, fewer nutrient shortcuts, and reduced biological complexity in many regions. This role, as ecosystem engineers, is inseparable from the long transition that carried whales from land into water. Only bodies large enough to store energy, travel long distances, and dive deeply could perform these functions at scale. Only creatures committed fully to life in the ocean could link distant environments so consistently. The consequences of that commitment ripple outward, shaping patterns of productivity, species distribution, and even climate regulation. Phytoplankton, supported by nutrient cycling, contribute to oxygen production and carbon storage, subtly influencing atmospheric balance over geological time. In this sense, whales participate in processes that extend beyond biology into planetary systems. Their impact is not loud or immediate, but cumulative, built from countless ordinary actions repeated across generations. Each dive, each breath, each migration adds to a larger pattern that structures life in the sea. The transition that once seemed risky and fragile ultimately created organisms capable of influencing Earth at a scale few species ever reach. Whales are not merely inhabitants of the ocean, they are participants in its maintenance, shaping conditions that support life far beyond their own, leaving a legacy that extends outward through water, time, and the living systems they help sustain. Across the modern world, several mammals live at the boundary between land and water, offering living comparisons that help clarify just how far whales ultimately traveled. Hippos, seals, and otters all rely on aquatic environments for food, safety, or movement, yet none have surrendered their relationship with land. Hippos spend much of their time submerged, bodies supported by water as they rest and move through rivers and lakes, but they still return to solid ground to feed, walk, and give birth. Their skeletons remain fully capable of bearing weight, their limbs strong and upright, their lungs designed for frequent access to air rather than prolonged submersion. Seals and sea lions move with impressive grace underwater, using flippers and streamlined bodies to hunt efficiently, yet they depend on land or ice for rest, breeding, and raising young. Their spines and joints retain the flexibility to shift back into a terrestrial mode when needed, awkward though it may appear. Otters, smaller and lighter, navigate water with playful precision, but their lives remain tightly bound to shorelines, rocks, and banks where they sleep, groom, and retreat from danger. In all of these animals, water is essential, but it is not exclusive. Land remains a necessary partner in survival, anchoring life in ways that water alone does not provide. What separates whales from these semi-aquatic relatives is not simply time spent in water, but the number and depth of adaptive barriers crossed without retreat. Other mammals that entered aquatic spaces retained escape routes. They preserved limbs capable of walking, spines capable of holding posture, and reproductive strategies dependent on solid ground. When conditions changed or risks increased, land remained an option. Whales relinquished these options one by one. They dismantled weight bearing structures, reoriented spines, redefined breathing, transformed reproduction, and reorganized sleep, sensory systems, and thermoregulation entirely around water. Each of these changes alone would have narrowed the possibility of return. Together, they closed it completely. No other mammal crossed so many thresholds in the same direction without stopping. Semi aquatic mammals adopted efficiency where it was useful and restraint where it was necessary. Whales accepted prolonged vulnerability, carrying incomplete systems forward until replacement systems could emerge. This willingness, driven by circumstance rather than intention, pushed them beyond the point where compromise remained viable. The result was a commitment unlike any other mammalian transition before or since. Whales did not balance land and water. They replaced one world with another. Their bodies no longer switch modes. They do not retreat to solid ground to recover strength or reproduce or sleep safely. Every essential function of life now unfolds within the ocean itself. This total commitment reshaped not only anatomy, but destiny. It allowed whales to enter open oceans, grow to immense size, shape ecosystems, and influence planetary cycles in ways semi-aquatic mammals never could. At the same time, it removed any path backward. Where hippos, seals, and otters remain flexible, able to adapt behaviorally without redefining biology, whales surrendered flexibility in exchange for mastery. Their journey reveals the outer limit of mammalian adaptation, showing how far a lineage can travel when each step forward makes the previous world impossible to return to. In comparing these paths, the difference becomes clear. Other mammals visit the water. Whales belong to it entirely, carrying within their bodies the record of the most complete environmental commitment a mammal has ever made. Even after decades of discovery and study, the story of whale evolution remains marked by absence as much as by evidence, shaped by what time chose to preserve and what it quietly erased. Fossils capture bones with remarkable loyalty, but soft tissues rarely survive the long passage into stone. Muscles that powered early swimming, organs that regulated breath and circulation, layers of fat that slowly reshaped bodies, and tissues that supported senses like hearing and balance almost never fossilize. These missing pieces once defined how these animals lived moment to moment, yet they vanish almost entirely from the physical record. As a result, much of the most important transformation unfolded in materials that decay long before sediment can seal them away. What remains are skeletal outlines that hint at function but cannot fully explain it, leaving scientists to reconstruct living systems from rigid frames alone. Bone shows where muscles attached, where joints moved, and how force traveled, but it cannot show how efficiently lungs stored oxygen, how blood chemistry adapted to pressure, or how nerves coordinated movement in a changing body. These invisible systems were critical to survival, yet they must be inferred indirectly, pieced together through comparison with living whales and other mammals rather than observed directly in fossil form. Behavior presents an even greater challenge. Fossils do not record how animals slept, how long they dove, how they coordinated with one another, or how they learned across generations. Patterns of migration, social structure, communication, and parenting leave little physical trace. Scientists reconstruct these aspects by reading context rather than artifacts, by examining where fossils are found, how they are distributed through time, and what modern descendants reveal through shared anatomy and physiology. A shift in bone structure may suggest a change in movement, but it cannot reveal how that movement felt, how often it occurred, or how risky it was in daily life. A modification to the ear can imply new modes of hearing, yet it cannot capture the soundscapes that shaped behavior. In this way, behavior remains one of the most incomplete chapters in the fossil record, understood through patterns rather than direct evidence. Each inference carries uncertainty, not because the science is weak, but because time preserved only fragments of a much richer story. Many transitional species also remain undiscovered, hidden in sediments that have yet to surface or lost to erosion before they could ever be studied. The fossil record is uneven by nature, shaped by where animals lived, where sediments accumulated, and where modern researchers have been able to search. Coastlines shift, oceans advance and retreat, and entire regions that once supported life now lie buried deep beneath continents or oceans. Early whale ancestors lived along dynamic shorelines where preservation was especially unlikely, environments prone to erosion and disturbance rather than stable burial. This means that the record we have is almost certainly incomplete, representing only a fraction of the diversity that once existed. Entire lineages may have risen and vanished without leaving a single fossil behind, their existence inferred only through gaps and sudden appearances of new forms. Each new discovery has the potential to reshape timelines, clarify relationships, or reveal unexpected pathways, reminding us that the narrative remains open rather than finalized. Because of these limits, the story of whale evolution should be understood as a living framework rather than a finished account. It is built from evidence, but also from careful reasoning across gaps that may never be filled completely. The absence of certain details does not weaken the story. Instead, it highlights the scale of what unfolded and the rarity of preservation across deep time. What we see is a skeleton of events, strong enough to support understanding, yet missing much of the texture that once surrounded it. The fossil record tells us that whales came from land, crossed multiple adaptive barriers, and committed fully to life in the ocean. It does not tell us every step, every experiment, or every failure along the way. Those details remain scattered, waiting in rock not yet found, or lost forever to the processes that shaped the earth itself. The story is incomplete, not because it lacks truth, but because time itself is selective. What remains is enough to reveal one of the most profound transformations in the history of life, even as it reminds us that much of that journey still lies beyond our reach, carried forward only through careful inference, patience, and wonder. Long after the last shoreline crossing and the final loss of land-based movement, the transition that shaped whales continues to matter because it reveals how evolution actually unfolds, not as a straight path toward improvement, but as a winding process filled with detours, compromises, and long stretches of instability. The story shows clearly that evolution is not efficient in the way human design often imagines efficiency. Systems break before they are rebuilt. Abilities weaken long before alternatives appear. For millions of years, early whales lived with bodies that worked poorly in every environment they occupied, carrying traits that offered no immediate advantage and sometimes imposed real danger. Movement became clumsy before it became powerful. Senses dulled before they adapted. Breathing, feeding, sleep, and reproduction all entered phases where survival became harder, not easier. Yet evolution did not halt or reverse course because of this inefficiency. It continued forward because enough individuals survived despite those flaws. The whale transition reminds us that progress in biology often arrives late, after long periods of imbalance where nothing seems optimized and everything seems provisional. Improvement is not guaranteed at each step. Instead, persistence carries lineages through extended phases where survival depends on tolerating loss and uncertainty rather than gaining strength quickly. This story also matters because it highlights how vulnerability can be a prerequisite for transformation. Early whales did not become ocean masters by being well suited to water from the beginning. They survived by enduring exposure to multiple simultaneous risks: predators from two worlds, inefficient bodies, unreliable senses, and high reproductive costs. Survival during these phases required conditions that allowed time rather than advantage, stable environments, abundant food, and enough safety margins to absorb repeated failures. Many lineages entered this vulnerable space and did not make it through. Those extinctions are just as much a part of the story as the survivors. The transition teaches that major evolutionary change is rarely safe. It often requires organisms to pass through extended periods where survival odds are lower, not higher. Vulnerability becomes the price of accessing new possibilities. Without tolerance for that vulnerability, the transformation cannot proceed, no matter how promising the destination might eventually be. The whale transition also demonstrates that large evolutionary shifts carry extreme risk, not only at the start, but throughout the process. At multiple points, the entire lineage could have disappeared, undone by climate change, habitat loss, or the failure of one critical system to stabilize in time. There was no guarantee that breathing would adapt, that feeding would recover, or that locomotion would eventually become efficient. Each solution arrived just late enough to prevent collapse, and no earlier. Evolution did not plan this outcome or guide it towards success. It responded to immediate pressures, one generation at a time, without foresight. From this perspective, whales are not an inevitable outcome of mammalian evolution, but a rare result of a particular sequence of survivals that could easily have failed. The fossil record shows that many similar attempts did fail, reinforcing how narrow the path to success truly was. Most importantly, this transition still matters because it challenges the comforting idea that success in evolution is common or expected. Whales feel iconic today because they survived and flourished, but their existence represents a statistical exception rather than a rule. For every lineage that crossed such a boundary, countless others stalled or vanished. The ocean is full of life, yet only one mammalian group ever committed to it completely and crossed every adaptive barrier required to thrive there. This rarity gives the whale story its weight. It shows that evolution can produce extraordinary outcomes, but only under specific circumstances, with immense cost, and with no promise of reward. Success is something that happens occasionally, not something nature guarantees. Remembering this reshapes how we understand life's history, not as a steady climb toward complexity or dominance, but as a fragile unfolding shaped by chance, persistence, and the willingness of living systems to endure long enough for possibility to emerge. As the long transformation reached its later stages, one truth became unavoidable: that some evolutionary choices, once made, could not be undone. Evolution does not preserve every option, it narrows them. Each adaptation that solved an immediate problem reshaped the body in ways that made other solutions less possible, sometimes impossible. In whales, this process unfolded gradually, without any single dramatic moment of commitment, yet its outcome was absolute. Limbs shortened and lost strength as swimming improved. Spines grew flexible at the cost of bearing weight. Breathing systems reorganized around dives rather than constant air access. Reproduction moved fully into water, abandoning the safety of land entirely. None of these changes were mistakes, and none were reckless. Each one offered an advantage in the moment it appeared. Yet together, they closed doors that could never be reopened. Evolution advanced not by keeping every path available, but by choosing one repeatedly until all alternatives quietly disappeared. This permanence reveals an important pattern about how adaptations work. Every solution carries opportunity and loss at the same time. When a structure changes to meet a new demand, it becomes less capable of fulfilling its former role. Strength traded away for flexibility does not return easily. Systems optimized for one environment struggle when forced back into another. Whales did not simply add aquatic traits to a terrestrial body. They replaced terrestrial systems entirely, piece by piece, until nothing remained that could support life on land. Once those systems were gone, returning would have required rebuilding multiple interconnected traits at once, something evolution rarely accomplishes. Selection works incrementally, favoring small advantages generation after generation. It cannot leap backward to restore a complex web of traits that no longer provide immediate benefit. In this way, adaptation behaves like commitment. It reinforces the direction already taken, rewarding further specialization while punishing deviation. The point of no return was not marked by a single trait, but by the integration of many. Losing the ability to stand might have been survivable if limbs remained strong. Shifting reproduction into water might have been reversible if walking still worked. Developing flukes might not have mattered if the spine retained upright stability. But all of these changes occurred together, reinforcing one another until land ceased to be relevant. By the time whales roamed the open ocean, their bodies no longer functioned as incomplete land mammals. They had become fully coherent aquatic organisms. At that stage, land was not a viable alternative. It was an incompatible environment. Evolution had crossed a threshold where retreat offered no advantage and only risk. Forward movement was the only remaining option. Yet even as these decisions became permanent, the past was not erased. It remained written into the body in subtle and persistent ways. Vestigial bones lingered beneath muscle, silent reminders of limbs that once carried weight. Developmental patterns still echoed terrestrial origins, tracing ancient instructions during growth before redirecting them into new forms. Whales continued to breathe air, give birth to live young, and nurse them with milk, carrying unmistakable signs of mammalian ancestry into a world their ancestors never knew. These traces do not contradict the permanence of the transition. They deepen it. They show that evolution does not rewrite life from scratch. It edits, modifies, and layers new functions over old foundations, leaving evidence behind for those who learn how to read it. The permanence of these evolutionary decisions gives the whale story its gravity. It shows that life can move so far along a path that returning is no longer possible, not because of failure, but because of success. Whales did not abandon land because it became hostile. They left it behind because water became home in every meaningful way. Their bodies still remember where they came from, but they no longer belong there. In that tension between memory and commitment, the story finds its depth. Evolution moves forward by closing doors, not cruelly, but decisively, shaping life through choices that cannot be revisited. Whales stand as living proof that some journeys, once taken far enough, become permanent, carrying history within them even as they move endlessly ahead. Even after tens of millions of years, shaped entirely by water, modern whales continue to carry unmistakable evidence of the ancient choice that set their lineage on this irreversible path. They breathe air, not water, rising rhythmically to the surface in a pattern that echoes their terrestrial past, even as their bodies remain perfectly adapted to the sea. Each breath is deliberate and controlled, taken through nostrils that migrated upward over deep time, repositioned for a life spent swimming rather than walking. This simple act links present behavior to an origin on land, a reminder that no matter how fully a species adapts to a new environment, traces of where it came from may remain embedded in daily survival. The ocean defines how whales live, but air still defines how they endure, tying every dive to the surface and every long journey to a moment of contact with the sky. Within their bodies, this history persists even more quietly. Vestigial bones remain hidden beneath muscle and tissue, remnants of hind limbs that no longer serve any mechanical purpose. These bones do not help whales swim, stand, or steer. They are carried forward not because they are useful, but because evolution rarely deletes what no longer interferes. Their presence is anatomical memory, a record preserved not in behavior but in structure, tracing the outline of legs that once bore weight and moved across solid ground. Development still produces these remnants during early growth, following instructions inherited from distant ancestors before redirecting them into a form suited for water. In this way, the body remembers even when the environment has changed completely. The ocean did not erase the past, it built upon it, layering new systems over old frameworks that never fully vanished. Other aspects of whale biology continue this pattern of deep continuity. Sleep, for instance, still reflects the needs of an air-breathing mammal rather than a fish. Whales cannot lose consciousness entirely without risking suffocation, so they rest one half of the brain at a time, maintaining awareness and control even during sleep. This solution did not arise from aquatic life alone. It emerged from the need to reconcile mammalian sleep with an environment that does not permit breathing without movement and awareness. Reproduction carries similar echoes. Whales give birth to live young and nurse them with milk, investing extraordinary time and energy into a single offspring. Calves are born tail first, guided to the surface for their first breath, immediately dependent on the mother for survival. These behaviors mirror land-based mammalian strategies, adapted carefully for water, not replaced by something entirely new. The ocean reshaped how reproduction unfolds, but it did not erase its origin. Together, these traits demonstrate that the transition from land to sea was never a clean break. It was an accumulation of decisions layered over inherited systems, each new adaptation modifying rather than replacing what came before. Even now, whales embody both past and present, carrying terrestrial ancestry within bodies that function exclusively in water. The transition is never fully erased because evolution does not work by starting over. It works by modifying what already exists, accepting constraints, and finding solutions within them. Whales did not become something other than mammals. They became mammals transformed by environment, history, and time. This living evidence gives the whale story its enduring power. Modern whales are not fossils of the past, nor are they creatures detached from their origins. They are ongoing expressions of a choice made long ago, still visible in breath, bone, sleep, and birth. Every time a whale surfaces, every time a calf nurses, every time dormant bones form without function, the ancient journey remains present. The ocean shaped the outcome, but the past continues to speak quietly through anatomy and behavior, reminding us that even the most dramatic evolutionary transformations leave traces behind. The story did not end with the transition. It continues, written into living bodies that carry history forward with every movement through water. Whales are often spoken of as ocean animals, icons of the sea whose size and grace seem inseparable from water itself, yet their story reaches deeper than that simple description. They are land mammals that are committed fully to a new world, carrying with them bodies shaped by a different gravity, different air, and a different way of living. Every stage of their transformation required loss as much as gain. Legs became useless before they disappeared. Senses faltered before they adapted. Breathing, feeding, sleeping, and giving birth all passed through long periods of danger where nothing worked perfectly and survival depended on endurance rather than advantage. The ocean did not welcome them gently. It tested every weakness, and only through persistence across countless generations did a few lineages manage to stabilize, refine, and finally flourish. In this way, the whale story is not a celebration of efficiency or inevitability. It is a record of risk taken repeatedly, of systems breaking before they were rebuilt, and of commitment that narrowed options until turning back was no longer possible. What makes this story linger is not only the outcome, but the permanence of it. Whales crossed a threshold where adaptation closed as many doors as it opened, locking their lineage into a future that could never return to land. That commitment reshaped not just anatomy, but destiny. It allowed whales to grow into giants, to roam entire oceans, to shape ecosystems, and to influence planetary cycles in subtle but lasting ways. At the same time, it ensured that traces of the past would remain, written quietly into their bodies through air breathing, vestigial bones, mammalian sleep, and maternal care. Even now, modern whales carry the memory of land within them, not as nostalgia, but as living evidence of how evolution works. Change does not erase history, it builds upon it, layer by layer, carrying old solutions forward, even when they no longer fit perfectly. This journey invites reflection on how much change a species can survive and how fragile success truly is. Whales exist today not because evolution guarantees progress, but because rare circumstances aligned across deep time, allowing vulnerability to persist long enough for transformation to complete. Many lineages attempted similar paths and vanished without record. Whales remind us that survival is not about choosing the safest option, but about enduring uncertainty when safer paths close. Their story stretches beyond biology into something quieter and more universal, showing that permanence often emerges only after prolonged instability, and that commitment can shape life as powerfully as innovation. If this long journey through deep time has stayed with you, take a moment to sit with which part of the transition lingered most strongly in your mind, whether it was the first awkward steps into water, the loss of walking, the rise of sound across vast distances, or the moment when returning to land was no longer possible. Sharing those reflections in the comments helps keep this calm community thoughtful and connected, and it shapes what stories we explore next. If you find value in these slow explorations of Earth's deep history, a like or a subscription quietly supports the continuation of this work. And if you are already part of this gentle circle of listeners, thank you for being here. Together, we can keep drifting through the long stories written into our planet, one patient chapter at a time, letting wonder, curiosity, and time itself guide us forward.